Hi everyone, thank you for tuning in for Instagram Live. Hi Ulka,
Hi Shreya.
how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for adding me to your live.
Of
This is
course.
my first experience with Instagram Lives.
Uh,
Hopefully it'll go
so,
well.
so is it. It's also mine. So I'm also trying to be as hands-on on tech as possible. Um, we'll just wait for a couple of seconds to have everyone join in, and then we'll
Sure,
start. Yeah.
sure. Is my audio okay? I've not used headphones. Yeah,
Yeah, it's perfectly fine. I can hear you very clearly.
thank you.
Okay. So just everyone joining in today, we're going to be speaking with Ulka Kelkar to unpack all the buzz around COP26, what it is and why it's so important. So I'm actually just going to start by introducing and talking a little bit about Ulka. Um, Ulka Kelkar is the director of the climate program at World Resources Institute. She's an economist by training and has worked as a research fellow with both TERI and the environmental think tank ETRI. Through her work, Ulka has studied how rural communities adapt to climate change and has also devised business models for low-cost, climate-resilient housing in disaster-prone areas of Nepal and Bangladesh. Thank you, Ulka, and welcome once again to this IG Live. Um, so I
Thank
think
you. It's great to be here. I've been following IDR's work for a long time, especially your humor, the cartoons, and witty tweets. So it's a pleasure to be here.
I'm glad. Cool. So I think we're good to start. So just to kind of start off this conversation, we can set a little context to what we're talking about. So could you tell us what the Conference of Parties or COP is all about, some highlights over the years, and why it's so important to global climate policy?
Right. So actually, this goes back a long way, all the way back to 1992, when there was this Rio Earth Summit that was organized, which was really the first big conference held under the United Nations, which gave importance to environment, biodiversity, and raised this issue of climate change. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was created at this 1992 Earth Summit. And then the next milestone was really something called the Kyoto Protocol, which happened 5 years later in 1997, when different countries agreed that they would make cuts to their emissions in order to save the world, in order to address this issue of climate change. And it was not done in a very scientific manner. It was still a new issue for most countries. So one country said we'll cut our emissions by 5%, another said we'll cut 8%. And it was recognized that the developed countries, which are already industrialized and advanced, should do more. And the developing countries should learn from their experience, get assistance in finance and technology transfer, and then a few years later take on their own commitments. From 1997 for the next 18 years, not that much happened. The world changed a lot. Not that much happened on changing the trajectory of where we were going with climate change. Emissions kept on rising. The next breakthrough was really in 2015 with the Paris Agreement, when countries took stock and realized that something needs to be done. The climate change problem is getting worse, and they came to a kind of agreement that every country would offer commitments or pledges to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in line with their developmental priorities, in line with what's important for them. And what they would agree to is they would agree to hold each other accountable. So in this United Nations framework, countries would pledge and agree to be reviewed by their fellow countries. This is really very important because climate change is a different kind of environmental problem. It's caused by a gas that gets mixed into the atmosphere. It also has impacts that could affect any country, anywhere. And countries worry that if they don't have common rules, then the kinds of activities that lead to greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's industry, whether it's energy, whether it's transport, if you don't have common rules to regulate these, then some countries will lose out and some countries will gain by taking climate action. So that's why a multilateral framework under the United Nations kind of umbrella becomes very important for the problem like climate change, maybe less so for other environmental problems. So that's really where we are right now. The other reason why the Paris Agreement and this COP process, where countries meet every year, why that's important, is because in some sense it is guided by science, which often a lot of economic policy or national policy may not always be guided by science. And there is a long-term continuity. So you may have some countries, the governments change. We've had examples of countries withdrawing and then coming back into this Paris Agreement. But there is a long-term continuity because of this UN umbrella. So I think that's why it's a kind of important kind of forum to be part of. Someone described it as the Olympics, except it happens every year instead of every 4 years. So we have a big one coming up just 5 days from now.
Yeah, and you mentioned it's, the big one. So why is COP26 so important and, what can we expect from it? I know everyone is kind of gearing up for it. I'm guessing there's a lot of buzz at where you're at as well, World Resources Institute. So why is it so important?
Well, one reason why everyone's waiting for this one is because it is 5 years after the Paris Agreement. So in 2015, 2016, countries made their commitments. Now it's a good time to see if the Paris Agreement is working or not. It was always the plan that every few years we will take stock and see if we need to do more. So that's really the momentum that has been building up 5 years after Paris. Another reason for the anticipation is because last year's COP got cancelled because of the pandemic. Countries couldn't travel. And so there's been a gap of 2 years instead of 1 year. During these 2 years, a couple of things changed politically. One was President Trump of the United States, who had actually withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. He lost the election, and a new president came to power who had actually campaigned to the youth saying that he will take strong climate action. So now we have this a little bit of greater momentum from the US of pushing all countries to do more. The other thing that has happened is Brexit. So the host of this year's COP is UK. It is being held in Glasgow in Scotland. And the UK government has also been quite enthusiastic about making the Glasgow Pact as much of a success as the Paris Agreement was 5 years ago. So there's a lot of anticipation, a lot of excitement about it. But if you get down to it, really, there are three things that are going to happen at this COP, which really make it a very important COP. The first is that a lot of the rules of the Paris Agreement are still pending. They were still left hanging. People said, let's agree on the big picture. We'll agree on the detailed rules over the next few years. Now it's high time that we conclude negotiations on those rules. We've had enough years of discussions, and we need to kind of sew up the details so that we can get on with the business of implementing the Paris Agreement. So that's something that is supposed to happen at this COP. The second is this big, long overdue issue of climate finance. Many years ago, I think it was in 2009, countries came up with this symbolic figure of $100 billion per year to be provided from developed countries to developing countries during the period of 2020 to 2025. And since then, they have struggled to reach that number. In fact, they struggled to reach anywhere near that number. And to developing countries, this is a kind of mark of losing trust. If developed countries are not keeping to their promises, then why are we being asked to do more on cutting back on emissions? So the climate finance issue has become really quite a make or break issue at this year's COP. So let's see if we hear some good announcements. There was a report that came out just last evening, which was really very pessimistic. It said that we won't reach the $100 billion figure even maybe by 2023. And in the meantime, there are more and more assessments coming out saying that what countries need to address climate change is not in the billions, but in the trillions. So clearly there's a big mismatch here, and there is this expectation of what will happen at this COP on finance, especially for adapting to the impacts of climate change. The third big issue at this COP is really this momentum of announcing what are being called net zero targets. I think a lot of people would be seeing this in the headlines. what is really net zero? It's like a long-term commitment. So normally in the COP process, countries make short-term commitments. So what will you do in the next 5 years? And you revisit that, you get a chance to correct that. A long-term commitment is on the time horizon of, say, 3 decades or more. So you announce something for 2050, 30 years from now, and you sort of make shorter term plans that then align with that longer term goal. This long-term strategy was always part of the Paris Agreement, but the specific requirement of net zero by 2050 was not part of the Paris Agreement. It was not something that countries like India actually agreed to 5 years ago. It is something that has gained a lot of momentum in the last year, particularly, and especially because the IPCC, the scientific body that reviews climate science every few years, said that if we want to stabilize the Earth's warming to a safe temperature, then we need to halve our greenhouse gas emissions in 10 years by 2030 and cut them to almost zero by 2050, by the middle of the century. You can interpret 2050 as plus or minus a few years. Now, what developing countries like ours are saying is that this is tough. This is really going to be tough for the country that's developing, that needs to provide energy to people, that needs to build cities. So there's going to be a lot of really serious discussion, as in fact has been happening over the last year, but it's going to reach a fever pitch just before or at this COP in Glasgow. So very exciting for people like us.
Yes. Thank you for putting that context widely. For everyone who's just joined in, welcome. We're chatting with Ulka about COP and why it's important. I'm Shreya, I'm from IDR, and yeah, we'll move on to our next question. So we've spoken about what COP is and what COP26 is, why it's important. What could it mean for India, right? What could it mean for India's climate strategy? Could you talk a little bit about
Right. So, first of all, just to take a kind of step back and take a global picture, we spoke earlier about why it's important to have a global framework like the Paris Agreement and not just leave climate action to each country to do separately. Because climate change is a global problem and all countries need to take action together. So, before the Paris Agreement happened, we were actually on track to have 4 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. That would be catastrophic.
Yeah.
Humans would just not be able to manage. After the first set of climate commitments that were announced after the Paris Agreement, because of the pledges that countries took, that came down to 3 degrees Celsius of warming. So we are looking at a future of 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. As of now, if you look at the announcements that various countries have made, whether they have promised them in the Paris Agreement, formally submitted a document, or just announced it, but suppose you take them all at their word, then we are headed for 2.1 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. So for India, this has a direct impact on our agriculture, on our coasts, on just the heating, the heat stress that we will face. So, so the success of this kind of global agreement is really important for us. 2 degrees Celsius is something that we could perhaps learn to adapt to, but even better, even safer would be if we could bring it down to 1.5, 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So that's really the big picture. Yeah. Specifically on India, there's a lot that's already happening. So just to give an example, on renewable energy, we are planning to triple our renewable energy capacity in just 9 years. So right now, India has 150 gigawatts of renewable energy, that's solar, wind, hydro. And we're saying that we'll make this 450 gigawatts by 2030. That's a really massive commitment. And in some sense, what India is saying is that, yes, we need to develop. Yes, we need to provide more energy to people. But all of that new electricity capacity is going to come from clean sources. So that's a pretty massive commitment. Right now, it's a domestic target. It is not yet a formally submitted target under the Paris Agreement, to the world community. But let's see, perhaps we might see some moves towards that end. The other big move that's happening in the transport sector is you would have all seen a lot of advertisements about how the electric vehicles market is booming, especially for electric two-wheelers. That's a really important way of cleaning up our urban environment. but it must go hand in hand with the cleaning of the electricity that's used to run those vehicles. So it's not enough to just have electric vehicles, you must also have renewable energy powering those vehicles at the back end. The third, you'll be interested to know that the Indian Railways has a net zero target. So the Railways has said that just by 2030, we'll become net zero. We'll electrify all our tracks, all our trains, and we will generate our own renewable energy to run those trains and tracks. So that's again something. All of these are domestic moves. There are some slightly difficult parts which India can't immediately do because the technology doesn't yet exist in a way that's affordable enough. And one of these is heavy industry. So the cement and the steel that we use to build our cities, our infrastructure, that is produced through a very energy intensive, very emissions intensive process. And right now we don't have the technology to clean that up immediately. The sort of move that's happening is to use hydrogen as a fuel. Hydrogen as a very clean fuel if it's produced again from renewable energy. But this will take time. But already we are seeing industry very interested in it. We are seeing government announcing R&D, research and development in this. And hopefully by 2025, 2030, we'll start seeing hydrogen enter our heavy industry as a fuel and in fact start cleaning up, and so that that mid-century target becomes more feasible. Even more difficult for us is the issue of coal phase out. Yeah. A lot of Western countries in particular look at India's coal power plants and say, why have all of, even if you have a lot of renewable energy, as long as you still have this coal, you will still have emissions. So first of all, it's important to realize that, if we have that 450 gigawatts of RE by 2030, then most of our electricity will be coming from that. Coal will be a smaller fraction. But also, again, there are moves because renewables is becoming cheaper than coal. So every time a new power plant needs to be set up and someone needs to weigh, should I set up a coal power plant or a renewable power plant? Actually, renewables wins out on economics alone. So there are many states, many companies, public sector companies, private sector companies that have actually said we won't build new coal power plants. We don't need to. We can meet our energy needs without creating new coal power plants. So these are really the various kind of trade-offs, the various questions that India is facing right now, the Indian economy is facing right now. We need to meet our energy needs. We need to develop our economy, but we can also do it in a way that doesn't have adverse environmental consequences. We can do it cleanly in a way that's good for the global environment as well as for the local environment.
Right. And, you mentioned formally submitted agreements. So just coming to the nationally determined contributions, right? Like, could you talk about where India's current NDCs stand, what they are, and what you would be expecting out of them?
Yeah, so NDC stands for Nationally Determined Contribution, which basically means that what is each country offering to do in a way that is in line with its development priorities, that is in line with what its current needs are. So hence nationally determined. So in the Paris Agreement, India actually had 3 targets. The first was that India said that we are a growing economy, but we'll make sure that that economy grows cleanly. And the way to capture this was in a metric called GHG intensity of GDP. So GDP is our, like our income, our economic production per unit of GDP produced. Can we bring down the emissions associated with that? And we said that compared to where we were in 2005, we'll be 33 to 35% less than that, below that in 2030. So it was a downward trend that we were promising to do. And we find we're very much on track for that. So if you look at the current data, the latest data that's available, I think by 2016, official statistics say that already it was 24% below the 2005 levels. So certainly we are going down, and the reason is many things. We're using more clean energy, renewable energy. We're using that energy more efficiently through efficient appliances, efficient industrial processes. And we're also having more services sector jobs, right? So our GDP has little less of manufacturing and little more of services, which tends to be cleaner. So on that NDC, we are on track, and in fact, we can do much better. The second NDC was specifically about how much of our electricity is going to come from fossil fuels and how much will come from cleaner fuels. And so we took this target that 40% of our installed capacity, electricity capacity in 2030, will come from non-fossil fuels. And we said that we will do that by 2030. Actually, we've almost reached it in 2021. As of September, we were at 39.8%. So almost touching the 40% mark. So I think there again, we can do even more as this momentum is increasing in the renewable energy industry. We could perhaps even revise our targets and say, here we are willing to ratchet it up, as actually the Paris Agreement requires all countries to consider. The third target is related to forestry and land use. So trees absorb a lot of carbon, both in when they're growing as well as the soil in which they grow. And it's not just trees, but also grasslands, mangroves, all kinds of ecosystems store away carbon in a way that is good for the environment and for the climate. India said in the Paris Agreement that we would create additional 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon we would absorb or we would store away through forests. This is a slightly difficult one because in India, land is very scarce. It has multiple competing uses. We need to grow food. We need to have these solar farms. We need to expand our cities. We need to harvest rainwater. There's really so many different competing uses for the land. And that's why it becomes difficult to expand the area under forests. So that's why on this particular target, I'm really not sure where we are. I think we are on the right track, but probably not in a position to increase our commitments under the forest NDC. So what organizations like mine have been trying to suggest is that let's look for all kinds of opportunities, for example, agroforestry, where farmers can also derive incomes through trees like fruit trees or other kinds of trees which can be grown on the peripheries of their farms. So it's good for the global environment, but it's also provides an additional livelihood, provided that it is done in partnership with the farmers and the communities.
Every time we chat about climate change and climate action, I just come to realize how intricately connected everything is, and how every step that we need to take can't be sort of in a tunnel vision. It needs to be thought through, but it needs to be thought through now. Everyone needs to be adopting like a climate lens. So I mean, just coming to say our last question, we've spoken about what COP is. We've spoken about India's sort of standing with COP, how it could affect India's climate strategy. Do you think, and according to you, are there some conversations that are still missing from, global talks in climate and conferences like COP?
I think there was one conversation that actually is now getting a little bit of the due credit, which is the interlinkage between climate and biodiversity. So sometimes we are guilty, in climate change circles of thinking of it as a technology problem, as an energy problem. At most, we might recognize our individual behavioral, implications and think of it as that. But we often don't connect it to nature and biodiversity and other forms of environmental issues. This year at this COP, I think a special effort is being made to tie these two things together, climate and biodiversity. And I think nature is going to get a little bit more of its due status. Otherwise, they are covered under two different conventions. We have a convention on biodiversity and we have a convention on climate change, and the two don't talk to each other sometimes. But so I think that is one good thing that's happening this time. The second, I would say, is just this issue of finance. It gets reduced to one number because that's what could be negotiated at that time. But it's so much deeper than that. A lot of the technologies that we need, for example, often can't be transferred by governments. They often require partnerships outside the negotiating framework. They could be government partnerships, or they could be private commercial investments, or a combination of both. But sometimes technology transfer gets neglected in these negotiations. It's somehow seen as too tricky, too commercial to actually do it justice, and somehow it has not not been covered well. But I think this year we've seen a lot of moves towards technology partnerships between India and US, UK, Denmark, Sweden, especially on these, these difficult sectors. Like just recently, I think what you might expect to hear at this COP is a new coalition of what are called the difficult to abate or harder to abate sectors, which are steel, trucking, aviation, and shipping. And a lot of private companies are going to sign up and take on very strong targets, which basically will mean adopting new technologies. So I think, again, at this COP, we might see some move. It's actually very important that things like aviation and shipping should be considered, because when countries report their greenhouse gas emissions, their national inventory, they don't consider international aviation and international shipping. That is not considered to belong to any one country. So it's very important to have that also covered, because the negotiations may not cover that. And the third issue really is what the most vulnerable, poorest countries are highlighting, which is that it is called loss and damage. By loss, we mean loss of lives, and by damage, we mean damage to property. And this is because of the growing frequency of extreme events. So what they're saying is that there are limits to adapting to climate change. Everything cannot be solved through new technologies or new kinds of practices, say cropping practices or migration. Finally, there's a hard limit when extreme events start happening more and more frequently. So you need to actually compensate those who are already being affected for the loss of lives and the damage to property. And this has never been discussed in the negotiations very fully, because it makes the developed countries very nervous to bring in issues of legal liability. So I think this also at this COP is going to get a little more attention and a little more of a spotlight on it, that how much finance are you putting in for loss and damage specifically.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you for your comments, everyone. Ulka, would you want to add anything, say anything at the end, anything you think we've missed out on that you would like to just speak about?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'd like to say is, I've been working on this topic for, I started working on this topic straight after my master's in 1999. I did a master's in economics and got interested in environmental economics and started doing this. It may seem that, things are happening at a snail's pace. Right. It may seem it's easy to be cynical and hopeless. But actually, this is really important. And there's a lot of progress that's happening, particularly because of so much youth activism in the last few years, right? So one thing I wanted to say was that, often when we even hear announcements, we tend to be a little dismissive or cynical of them, thinking that it's all just greenwashing. But actually, there are organizations, there are efforts to make sure that any announcements, any pledges, are really done in a meaningful way. Maybe initially for the country or the company, this might be a new thing. They may not know the right methods, but there are definitely, you could call them watchdogs, or you could call them scientific organizations, who can provide the right kinds of approaches to make sure that pledges are not just words. They actually translate into actions and to hard emissions cuts. So I would suggest that, everybody for whom climate change is relatively new, you're reading about it in the newspaper, don't fall prey to being hopeless or cynical. In fact, just keep asking questions so that we can make sure that whatever is said is also implemented in a meaningful way.
Thank you. You're being very optimistic, and I hope some of the people who've tuned in also take this optimism back with them. So thank you so much, Ulka, for joining us. And thank you everyone for tuning in today. We will be doing another Instagram Live with Ulka after COP gets over to understand exactly what went on in Glasgow. And we'll be announcing that soon on our social media handles, so you can watch this space for the announcement. In the meantime, if you would like to learn more about India's climate action strategies, the second episode of IDR's podcast, On the Contrary, titled Climate Change, Top Down, Bottom Up, with Ulka, Nitin Desai, and host Arun Myra, will be going live tomorrow across Spotify, Google Podcasts, and other podcasting apps. So please do listen to it and subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you so much, Ulka, and thank you everyone. I'm Shreya Adhikari from IDR. See you all next time.
Thank you.